Hi, Annie from Hoop Sisters, and in today's video we're going to learn how to make one of the triangle blocks from our 2019 mystery quilt. It's one with the cute little prairie points and the scalloped 3D additions to it. What we have is, I have all my supplies. I have a piece of battleizer. It's going to be enough to a couple pieces to make my block. I have my fabric 1, 2, and 3. I have the backing fabric for my blocks. I also have my prepared wool and my cute little triangles. I'm making the small block for the video. I have 2 different pieces of fabric so I can make my scallops. And I have a bunch of little prairie points all pressed and ready to go into the quilt. I have water-soluble thread and an embroidery bobbin thread. I have my quilting thread and a matching bobbin. And I have hooped a lightweight cutaway already ready to go, and blue painter's tape or masking tape, whichever one you want. We don't need paintbrushes, but we do need the tape. So let's get started on making the scallops, and then we will go ahead and complete a block with scallops and also one with prairie points. So for step number 1, I have my lightweight cutaway in the hoop. I have embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin and water-soluble thread, the Vanish Light, in the needle. And what we're going to do first is with that thread, and I got my fabric out, but we're not going to use it. That's for the next step. First, we're going to stitch a placement stitch onto my lightweight cutaway. And then with the 2 pieces of fabric that the instructions call for, it's the backing and stashing fabric, the 2 rectangles. I have the 2 right sides together, and we're just going to place that right over the top, centered over the placement stitch. Just going to peek underneath and make sure that I have all my edges equally covered. And then the machine will sew a tack down stitch. I just had to check my thread. We still have water-soluble thread in the needle. For step 3, I have put my neutral thread in the needle end in the bobbin, and now we're going to sew the seams for the scallops. And it will sew over each seam twice because we're going to be cutting fairly close to that, and we want to make sure that just in case you happen to cut through, that maybe you won't cut through both of the seams. So we'll let this finish, and then I'll show you how to cut it. Alright, my scallops are all stitched, so I'm going to pop this out of the hoop. And now wherever there is a straight line of stitching, we're going to use our trimmer by George, the ruler side, and we're going to cut right on that line. Okay, so now we have our, I'll turn the block and we'll cut on these lines. We're going to cut these into rows. So again, we're just cutting right exactly on the line. As you can see, we're going to have a few rows of scallops. This hooping, each hooping is enough to do 2 blocks. I believe the mystery quilt calls for doing this hooping twice. Okay, so now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take these and I'm going to trim them with my little Hoop Scissors Mini about 1/8 of an inch from the stitching, and then I'll turn them and we'll press them, so I'll be back when it's time to do that part. Okay, I have trimmed about 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little bit closer to the stitching. I've also removed my cutaway stabilizer, so now I'm going to go turn and press it. Okay, I have cut apart all my little scallops, and once I had them cut apart, I removed this cutaway stabilizer, and then I turned them and pressed them. And you can choose which side you want showing, whether you want it to be all the same fabric, or if you want it to alternate and be different, or each block be a little bit different. You can also use a little, some wider rickrack or a cute ribbon. And of course, we're also going to show you how to do it with the little Prairie Points. So with the Prairie Points, all we did was take a square of fabric and press it twice on the diagonal till we get our little Prairie Point. So we're going to show you a couple different ways to do it in this video. So now that we have our little Prairie Points and scallops ready, we can go ahead and we can begin stitching our block. So I have my battleizer and the hoop, and we'll go to the machine and we'll begin our block. Okay, for step 1, I have water-soluble thread in the needle, and I have embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin. We're going to stitch an outline for where to place our wool. Step 2, we're still going to be using the water-soluble thread, and I'm going to place my piece of prepared wool right over the top of that placement stitch, and it's going to sew a zigzag to hold it in place. And you'll just need to hold it in place until it gets that edge stitched. Just keep your fingers away from the needle. When you're sewing that wool on, you're going to want to make sure that your presser foot is in the highest position that your machine will allow, and that'll help clear keep it from getting caught. I see that part of my zigzag stitch has a little bit of wool hanging over, so if that ever happens to you, just get out your Hoop Scissors Mini and trim that right up to the zigzag stitches. For step 3, we're also going to just continue with our water-soluble thread, and it's going to sew the pattern outline right over the top of the wool. And if you choose not to use the wool, then that's very simple. You just skip over this step right here, which is step 3. The wool is nice because it gives a little added dimension to your quilt. And for step 4, going to need my fabric 1, and I'm going to place my fabric 1 right over the top of this bottom area, And I'm going to make sure that I have the edges covered over on this edge. And I'm going to make sure that I have at least 1/4 inch above, so that that will be our seam. So with water soluble thread, we'll sew a tack down to attach fabric 1. For step 5 is when we're going to be adding our either our Prairie Points or our scallops. So I'm going to show you the scallops first. If the scallops, you can choose which side of your fabric that you want to be showing, whether you want the polka dot or whether I want this side, so you can choose which one. And then you just lay the raw edges even on that top seam. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take your fabric 2 and you're going to lay that right sides down, raw edges even, leaving about 1/2 inch over here on the seam allowance over to what would be your right. And you just lay that there. I have neutral thread in the needle, and so now we can go ahead and stitch the seam. If you want to, if you feel more comfortable when you're doing this, if you want to do a little dab of glue right there in the seam, I'll do that right now so you can see. Don't need a lot. You just need a little teeny tiny dab, just in a couple places. And it's just so that when you go to put your fabric 2 over the top, that it doesn't move. I have not had any problem with it moving, but if you do experience that, that's something you can do. Then my fabric 2, raw edges even. And now with the neutral thread in the machine, I'll go ahead and stitch my seam. Okay, there we go. Take this off so you can see it a little better. I can flip my fabric right side up, my fabric 2, and I will finger press it. And then it's going to sew a tack down stitch. So there's our first row of cute little scallops. So step 6 is our tack down stitch. So right here I'm going to just trim, leaving about 3/8 to 1/2 inch on both sides. Just so we can get that long piece of fabric off of there. And we're going to place our next row of scallops. And as you can see, this is our next row. Hopefully you can see this is our next scallop, but since it's a triangle and it gets a little more narrow, you're going to now cut between the second and third scallop. You're just going to cut it right off, cut it in 2, and here again you can choose whether or not which side of the fabric you want to show. I think I'll just have a little fun with it and do the opposite one. And I do see also that if you need to have this trimmed a little bit, if it's a little bit too generous of a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you can go ahead and trim that right now. That helps you know where to place your scallops or your Prairie Points. Now I want to talk to you a little about the Prairie Points as well. If it was time for us, if we were doing a Prairie Point block, what you would want to do is you would want to place these Prairie Points so that there's a folded edge and there's also an open edge. You're going to want to place them so that they're both going the same way. And you're going to just place it even, and you may need to tuck the second one into the first one like so, and just make the raw edges even. And again, if you choose to use a little dab of glue just to hold everything in place, or so that things don't shift as you're adding your fabric 3, because then on top of that you're going to add your fabric 3 will be right side down over the top of your prairie points or your scallops, and that's where we sew the next seam. So since this is I think I'm going to mix these blocks up. I think I'm going to go ahead and do my prairie points here. We'll just have 2 blocks that are looking a little different, and again, this is a fun block you can do to be a little bit creative and do different things. So I'm just putting a dab of glue there so my prairie point will not come open, and also just a small amount, just a barely dab it into the seam allowance, and then I will place it with my raw edges even. Both of these, they will overlap a little bit, and that's fine. Makes it look a little bit more interesting. The glue, where I placed the glue, is stopping me from putting it where I want it. So now I'm going to take my fabric 3 and I'm going to lay it. I have a seam allowance, so I'm going to give it a little bit more generous over here on this end. So I'm going to place this right side down, raw edges even with the prairie points and the edge of that fabric. And then the machine will sew my seam. It'll be fun to see all the creative ideas that everyone can come up with. So now we can flip our fabric, finger press our seam, and we'll sew a tack down stitch for step 8. So I hope you're liking how it looks so far. I'm going to cut, leaving a 3/8. This is a small block, so I'm leaving 3/8 to a 1/2 inch, and about 1/2 inch on your large block as well. Now I'm going to place my final scallop or prairie point, and I'm going to go back to fabric 1. Hopefully you can all see our progress so far. So let's see. Scallop, prairie point scallop. I'm going to put my last scallop there, and again I can choose which side I want showing, whether I want my light polka dot or the same fabric that was used in the previous 2. I'm going to leave it the same fabric on here. You could even, on each block, you could even do rickrack on one, ribbon on another, prairie point on one. I mean, sky's the limit, and the fun you can have on this one. So again, I have my final scallop placed and centered over the top section with my raw edges even, back to fabric 1, and we're sewing a seam. Okay, now we can flip it and finger press it, and I'll trim, and then we'll add our backing fabric. So isn't that cute? It's just adorable. For step 10, I have my hoop off the machine. I've turned it upside down, and I can see the outline of my block. And this is my backing fabric. I've sprayed the wrong side with a little bit of KK 2000 from Sulky, and I'm going to just center it right over the top of that, and I'm going to do a little peek under all the sides to make sure there's an equal amount of fabric extending beyond that line. Then I can flip my hoop right side up. I can slide it back onto my machine. Did a little peek underneath just to make sure our fabric was still in place. And I'm I'm going to make sure that my final piece of fabric is flipped right. And with water-soluble thread and the needle, it's going to sew a basting stitch to attach the fabric to the back of the block. So when you get over here to these sides, just make sure that as it stitches that you can hold that fabric down. If it does, foot does tend to grab it and you stitch that fabric down and it flips over, it's just 1 or 2 stitches you need to cut out, and it'll be fine after that. So now I'm going to switch my thread and my needle and my bobbin so that it matches. I'm going to use my quilting thread next. So there is our block. I'm trying to show you at an awkward angle, and our backing fabric is on there. Yeah, there's probably no good way to show you on this camera angle, but I'm going to switch it and then I will show you how to do the quilting since we have our Prairie Points and Scallops on there, and that's where the painter's tape comes in. Okay, for step 11, 12, 13, and 14, the last few steps, it's the quilting, and I have matched my needle and bobbin thread. I have my quilting thread in there, and I'm going to see if I can turn this so you can see and do it upside down. Okay, so here are our scallops for the first row. This is going to be the first section of quilting. And what you're going to need to do, of course, so that it doesn't stitch down your scallops, is you're going to have to get those out of the way. The first time I did this, I just held them out of the way with my stylus, which is fine, but then I realized it'd probably be easier and safer to just get out the old painter's tape. And I'm just going to take those scallops and pull them up out of the way, lay down my painter's tape. And now since we have our backing fabric on, we want it to look pretty on the back. Don't forget to bring your needle, your bobbin thread to the top and turn off your automatic thread cutter. So actually your automatic thread cutter in this one probably wouldn't be as big a deal, but just out of habit we do that to keep the back looking nicer. So I'm going to bring my needle thread to the top, and then I can begin stitching my quilting. And I'll just cut that thread tail when it moves out of the way. And then that painter's tape holds the scallops and the prairie points out of the way so that you can do the quilting. Don't have painter's tape, masking tape works just as well. Alright, so we're done with that step, and we can go ahead and we can put the scallops down, and now we need to get these prairie points out of the way. So again, with the painter's tape, I'll just grab those prairie points and tape them up so they stay out of the way. Okay, one last little scallop to get out of the way. Just gotta cut a thread tail. Okay, and the very last piece of quilting. That's it. We are finished with this block. Now we'll work on trimming it. There it is. Here's my back. So my completed Prairie Point / scallop block, we're going to trim 3/8 of an inch from the basting stitch through all the layers. Okay, and here is our completed Prairie Point and scallop block. It's just adorable. Can't wait to see what you guys do with rickrack and ribbon and all different colors of fabric. So we look forward to seeing your blocks. Please post them. Thanks.